Sometimes the person who saves your life is the one who has every right to end it. Marcus Thorne learned this truth the hard way, collapsing face first into the Sonoran desert, with a bullet wound festering in his leg and vultures already circling overhead. He'd been a fool to ride out alone, chasing down cattle rustlers at 53 years old, like he was still some hot-blooded kid with something to prove. The infection had taken hold 3 days prior, turning his veins black and his mind into a fever dream carnival of regret and hallucination. When his horse finally threw him 2 miles from nowhere, Marcus didn't even have the strength to curse. He just lay there, tasting copper and sand, watching the sky turn from blue to white to nothing at all. Death, he thought, might actually be a mercy, but mercy wasn't what found him. When consciousness clawed its way back into Marcus's skull, the first thing he registered was shade, blessed, impossible shade in a landscape that knew no kindness. The second thing was pain, sharp and clinical, like someone was carving survival into his rotting flesh whether he wanted it or not. The third thing was her voice, low and commanding as distant thunder. "Don't move!" Marcus's eyes fluttered open to a sight that made him question whether he'd actually died and gone to some strange purgatory. Looming over him was a woman who looked like she'd been carved from the desert itself, easily 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of massacred nations. Her skin was copper in the failing light. Her dark hair shot through with silver and bound back with leather cord. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were the eyes of someone who'd watched the world end and somehow kept breathing anyway. Her name was Ayanna, though Marcus wouldn't learn this for 2 more days. What he learned immediately was that she possessed the kind of competence that comes only from necessity, the economy of movement that separates survivors from corpses in unforgiving country. She worked on his leg with strips of clean cloth and some foul-smelling poultice that burned like hellfire and probably saved his life. Her hands were calloused, precise, and utterly without gentleness. This wasn't comfort. This was function. Marcus tried to speak, to thank her, to ask where in God's name she'd come from, but she cut him off with a single raised finger. "Save your strength," she said, her voice carrying the faint accent of someone whose first language had been beaten out of them by boarding schools and broken treaties. "You'll need it for leaving." The shelter she'd constructed was nothing more than canvas, stretched between Joshua trees, and secured with rope that had seen better decades. Beside it sat a weathered wagon, its paint long since surrendered to sun and sandstorm. This was temporary residence, Marcus realized, the camp of someone who'd learned not to put down roots because roots could be torn up. Over the next 3 days, as fever came and went like unwanted company, Marcus existed in fragments. Sometimes he woke to find Ayanna scanning the horizon with the vigilance of a woman who knew exactly what kind of monsters the world contained. Sometimes he woke to the sound of her humming, a melody that felt older than the rocks themselves, mournful and defiant in equal measure. And sometimes he woke to find her staring at a photograph she kept tucked in her belt, her expression so raw with loss that Marcus had to look away from the intrusion of witnessing it. She spoke little. When she did, it was instructions. "Drink this. Hold still. The wound's draining. That's good." Marcus found himself studying her in the lucid moments between fever dreams, cataloging details like a man preparing testimony. The way she rationed water with mathematical precision. The way she moved through space like someone who'd received military training or survived situations where hesitation meant death. The memorial beads woven into her wagon's frame, each one representing something, someone, lost. And most prominently, the markings on her forearms, intricate patterns of scars and ink that formed symbols Marcus hadn't seen in over 2 decades. symbols that made his blood run cold, even through the fever. On the fourth day, Marcos could sit upright without the world spinning into chaos. Ayanna had made a thin stew from rabbit and dessert sage, and they ate in silence as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that reminded Marcus of old blood on new ground. The firelight danced across Ayanna's arms as she stirred the pot, and in that flickering illumination, there was no hiding from recognition anymore. The pattern of scars, the specific placement of ink, the geometric precision that marked her as Akacheda, one of the nations that had been relocated under military escort 23 years prior. Marcus's hand started trembling so violently he nearly dropped his bowl. "I know those marks," he whispered, and the words felt like confession and condemnation all at once. Ayanna's entire body went rigid. The wooden spoon in her hand stopped moving. She didn't look at him, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge. But Marcus could feel the shift in the air, the way the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. "I need to tell you something," he continued, and his voice was barely holding together now, fracturing under the weight of what came next. "I need to tell you who I was." Still, she didn't turn, didn't give him permission, but she didn't walk away either. And in that terrible stillness, Marcus understood that she already knew what was coming. Some part of her had known the moment she'd looked at his face, recognized the age, done the mathematics of history and trauma. So he told her everything. The words came out broken, punctuated by sobs he'd kept locked away for more than 2 decades. He told her about being 23 years old and fresh in the cavalry, so proud of his uniform he could barely stand himself. He told her about the orders that came down in winter, orders to escort the Akacheda people on a forced relocation march across 200 miles of wasteland. He told her about the cold that killed the children first, their small bodies left beside the trail because the column wasn't permitted to stop for burials. He told her about the elders who collapsed from starvation and exhaustion, about families torn apart when some were deemed too slow and abandoned to die. He told her about the night he'd watched a young mother carrying her daughter through snow, both of them barefoot, because their shoes had disintegrated, and how he'd looked away when the little girl finally went still in her mother's arms. He told her about knowing, absolutely knowing that these orders were evil, were murder, were the kind of thing that made God turn his face away from humanity. And he told her that he'd followed them anyway. "I was there," Marcus gasped, tears streaming down his weathered face into his graying beard. "I was there when they marched your people to their deaths. I knew it was wrong. I knew, and I did nothing. I followed orders like a coward, like some—" His voice broke completely. "I recognized your markings the moment I woke up under your care. I should have told you then. Should have crawled away and let the desert finish what the bullet started. But I needed you to know, needed you to understand that the man you saved is the man who—" Ayanna stood, slowly, deliberately. She walked exactly 10 paces away from the fire, her back to Marcus, her shoulders rigid as iron. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, dense with decades of grief and rage and something Marcus couldn't name but recognized as dangerous. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet, he almost didn't hear it over the crackling flames. "My daughter died on that march," Ayanna said, each word precise as a knife blade. "Her name was Dakota. She was 6 years old." The sound that came out of Marcus wasn't human. It was the noise of a soul being torn from a body that had outlived its right to contain it. He doubled over, gasping, trying to find air in a world that had suddenly lost all oxygen. Ayanna still didn't turn around. "She loved birds," she continued in that terrible, quiet voice. "Used to sing to them. The song I was humming, that was hers. Marcus was openly sobbing now, great wrenching sounds that echoed across the empty desert. When she fell, your unit didn't stop. The column kept moving. I begged, I screamed, I tried to go back to her. Now, Ayanna's voice finally cracked. Just barely. They wouldn't let me. So my daughter died alone in the snow while I was dragged forward by soldiers with your same uniform, your same face. She turned then, and Marcus saw something in her expression that was worse than hatred, worse than rage. He saw recognition of his humanity and the burden that recognition carried. "Get out of my sight," Ayanna said. "And here's where you have to ask yourself something. If you'd committed an unforgivable sin and the person you'd wronged saved your life anyway, would you have the courage to stay and face what you'd done? Or would you run from the one chance at redemption you didn't deserve but desperately needed?" Marcus dragged himself outside into the freezing desert night with his infected legs screaming protest at every movement, expecting Ayanna to let the cold finish what mercy had interrupted. He crawled 20 yards from the fire before his strength gave out completely, collapsing against a sun-bleached boulder that still held the day's heat like a dying heart. The stars overhead were merciless in their beauty, indifferent witnesses to human suffering, and Marcus stared up at them, thinking that, dying here, alone, in pain, unforgiven, was probably the most honest ending a man like him deserved. He'd killed a child, not with his own hands, perhaps, but with his compliance, his silence, his cowardice, dressed up as duty. Dakota, 6 years old, loved birds. That little girl had a name now, a face constructed from Ayanna's broken voice, and Marcus knew he'd carry her ghost, alongside all the others, until whatever merciful or unmerciful God existed finally cut the thread. But here's what you need to understand about Ayanna. She was a woman who'd survived the unsurvivable, and survival creates its own terrible logic. When dawn broke across the desert in shades of pink and gold, Marcus woke to find a blanket covering his shivering body. Not gently placed, more like thrown from a distance, but covering him nonetheless. Within arm's reach sat a canteen of water and a piece of hardtack that tasted like dust and obligation. Ayanna herself was nowhere to be seen, but the message was clear as desert sky. "I haven't forgiven you. I will never forgive you, but I'm not going to let you die." The week that followed was a study in proximity and distance, in the impossible mathematics of what happens when victim and perpetrator occupy the same desperate space. Ayanna wouldn't look at Marcus, wouldn't speak to him except in the clipped monosyllables required for basic survival. "Water's low. Storm coming. Stay out of my way." She moved through her daily routines with the mechanical precision of someone who'd locked all feeling in a box and buried it deep. But Marcus watched, because watching was all he had left, and he saw the cracks. The way she touched that photograph of Dakota with fingertips so gentle they could have been handling spider silk. The way she flinched when the wind picked up and howled across the rocks, the sound too similar to wind across an open plain where children died of exposure. The way she stood guard through the night watches with a rifle across her knees, protecting against threats that existed, now only in memory and nightmare. Marcus began to move with the caution of a man approaching a wounded animal that could still kill him. He didn't ask permission because he knew it would be denied. He simply acted, and then retreated, and waited to see if she'd stop him. On the third morning, he noticed Ayanna coughing, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of dust and infection. He knew the cure, because every rancher in the territory knew it. Desert sage, the kind that grew in the rocky outcroppings 2 miles north where rattlesnakes sunned themselves on warm stone. His leg was barely healed, still seeping if he pushed too hard, but Marcus limped out before dawn and climbed those treacherous rocks with the determination of a penitent ascending toward absolution he'd never reach. The rattlesnake he disturbed was 6 feet of diamond-patterned death, and it was only luck, or perhaps cosmic irony, that kept its fangs from finding his already poisoned flesh. He gathered the sage in trembling hands, climbed back down, and left the bundled herbs near Ayana's supplies without a word. She said nothing, but the next morning, the herbs were gone, and her cough had quieted. The wagon wheel spoke came next. Marcus noticed it during one of his careful circuits around the camp. Saw the crack that would become a catastrophic break the next time that wheel took any real weight. He had tools, basic ones, salvaged from his saddlebags that Ayana had somehow retrieved along with his half-dead body. He spent 2 days carving a replacement spoke from ironwood, fitting it with the obsessive precision of a man who understood that every act of service was both penance and prayer. The work reopened his leg wound, sent fresh blood seeping through the bandages. But Marcus didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Takota's name, her love of birds, the song Ayana hummed in the darkness. When he finally installed the new spoke and tested the wheel's integrity, he looked up to find Ayana watching him from 30 yards away. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds, 3 seconds of such raw, complicated emotion that Marcus felt his chest constrict before she turned away without acknowledgement. But she didn't tell him to stop. The water filter was an act of observation and desperation combined. Marcus saw how Ayana rationed every drop with the discipline of someone who'd learned that thirst was just another form of death you could postpone but never defeat. He fashioned a filtration system from layered stones and charcoal and cloth, primitive but functional, something that might stretch their water supply by precious days. He placed it near the wagon at dusk. At dawn, it had been moved closer to the main camp, incorporated into her survival infrastructure without comment or acknowledgement. This was their language now. Silent actions and unspoken acceptance. A dance of redemption and resistance playing out in a landscape that cared nothing for human drama. And then the sky began to change. Marcus saw it first. The peculiar yellow-gray quality that veteran desert dwellers recognize as harbinger of catastrophe. The dust storm building on the western horizon wasn't just weather. It was apocalypse made manifest. A wall of sand and wind that could strip flesh from bone and bury entire homesteads under dunes that appeared overnight. Ayana's canvas shelter wouldn't survive the first 10 minutes. But Marcus remembered a rock formation he'd passed during his delirium march 3 weeks prior. A natural fortress of stone about half a mile northeast. The kind of place that might offer actual protection if they could reach it in time. The problem was simple and insurmountable. Moving all of Ayana's supplies, the essential equipment for her survival, was impossible for her alone. And Marcus was still a man with a healing bullet wound and lungs that weren't quite ready for the kind of exertion this would require. He started carrying supplies anyway. The first box he lifted, filled with dried goods and cooking implements, sent a lightning bolt of agony through his damaged leg that made his vision white out at the edges. He staggered, caught himself, kept moving. Ayana's voice cracked across the camp like a whip. "I don't need your help." Marcus set the box down at the edge of camp, returned for another. "Did you hear me? I said I don't—" "I know," Marcus interrupted, his voice steady despite the pain radiating through his entire lower body. He picked up a second box. Ayana stepped directly into his path, and for a moment they stood less than 3 feet apart, the closest they'd been since the confession. He could see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride versus pragmatism, rage versus survival. You think dragging boxes makes up for—" She started, but couldn't finish. Couldn't say the words, couldn't name what could never be compensated for. "No," Marcus said quietly, meeting her gaze fully for the first time in a week. "Nothing makes up for it. There is no scale where Dakota's life balances against anything I could ever do. But we'll both die if we stay here, and I'm not letting you die to make a point about my guilt." The wind was already picking up, sending scouts of sand swirling around their ankles, like advance warning of the army approaching. Ayanna stared at him for 5 seconds that felt like 5 years, then stepped aside. "Fine," she said, the word like broken glass. "But don't expect gratitude. Don't expect anything." "I don't," Marcus replied, and kept moving. They worked in tense silence as the storm built from threat to certainty, racing against a deadline written in darkening sky and rising wind. Marcus pushed his body past every reasonable limit, feeling the bullet wound reopen fully, warm blood soaking through his pants and into his boot. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because this wasn't about redemption anymore. This was about the fundamental human imperative to not let someone die when you could prevent it. Even if that someone was the person you'd wronged most grievously, box after box, bundle after bundle. Ayanna worked with grim efficiency. Her movements, economical and practiced, but Marcus saw her glancing at his leg, seeing the spreading bloodstain, saying nothing. The memorial beads from her wagon frame were the last things loaded, carried with a reverence that made Marcus's throat close up. Each bead was a person. Each person was a Dakota. Each Dakota was a sin that could never be washed clean. They reached the rock formation with maybe 10 minutes to spare, stumbling into the natural alcove as the storm's leading edge hit with the force of divine wrath. The roar was immediate and total, a sound that erased all other sound, sand driven with such velocity it could flay exposed skin in seconds. They huddled in the shelter of ancient stone, their supplies packed tight around them, and that's when Marcus's leg finally gave out completely. He collapsed against the rock wall, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind, distantly aware of Ayanna cursing in 2 languages as she pulled out her medical supplies yet again. The intimacy was unbearable. Her hands on his leg, on the wound she'd saved once before, and now had to save again, in a space barely larger than a grave, with a storm screaming outside, like all the ghosts of the death march had found their voices. Marcus tried to speak, to apologize, but she cut him off with surgical precision. "Save it! You reopened everything getting us here, so lie still and let me work." The storm raged for 2 days. 2 days trapped in close quarters with nowhere to look but at each other. Nothing to hear but wind and whatever words managed to escape the walls they'd both built. On the second night, with sand still howling past their shelter, and darkness absolute except for a single candle stub, Ayanna asked the question Marcus had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. "Why?" Her voice was barely audible over the storm. "Why did you save yourself back then? Why didn't you refuse orders, desert? Why didn't you die with us?" Marcus didn't deflect, didn't make excuses. He owed her at least this much truth, even if truth was just another inadequate payment against infinite debt. "Because I was a coward," he said, staring at his hands in the candlelight. Hands that had held rifles and followed orders, and never once reached out to help when help was needed most. "I told myself I was powerless, that following orders was just surviving, that one soldier couldn't change the outcome. But the truth..." He finally looked at her, his face raw with decades of self-loathing. "I chose my life over theirs, over your daughter's. I chose comfort over courage, And every single day since, I've known that. Every day I've woken up and known I was the kind of man who'd watch children die, rather than risk himself. And now you want forgiveness, Ayanna said, and it wasn't quite a question. No. Marcus's voice was firm for the first time since the confession, carrying a conviction that surprised even him. I want nothing from you. You owe me nothing, less than nothing, but I'm not that soldier anymore. I can't undo what I did, can't bring Dakota back, can't make the march unhappen, but I can. He struggled for the right words, for language adequate to impossible things. I can only be different now, do different, not for redemption because there isn't any, but because being the same man who followed those orders would mean they were right about us, that we were just animals following our nature. The candle flickered, the storm screamed, and in that howling darkness, Ayanna began to speak, really speak, for the first time since the world ended. She told him about trying to desert once, about making it 3 miles from the column, before they caught him and beat him unconscious. About the officer who'd wanted to hang him as an example, but settled for 20 lashes and a dishonorable discharge that followed him like a curse. About leaving the military and fleeing west, trying to build a life as a rancher where nobody knew his history, where he could hide from what he'd been. But the nightmares never stopped, Marcus whispered. Every night I see that mother carrying her daughter. Every night she looks at me like she's asking why I didn't help, and I never have an answer. Ayanna listened, her expression unreadable in the dancing shadows. Then she told him about Dakota, not just her death, but her life. How she'd wanted to be a healer like her grandmother. How she'd once spent an entire afternoon nursing a bird with a broken wing back to health. How she'd asked, on the 3rd day of the march, why the soldiers looked so sad if they were just helping her people find a new home. She was smart, Ayanna said, and her voice fractured on the word. Too smart. She figured out what was happening before I could hide it from her. And on the last night when the fever took her, she looked at me and said, "Mama, I'm cold." And I couldn't. I had nothing. She broke off, unable to continue. "I hate you," Ayanna said finally, the words quiet and factual. "I will always hate what you were, what you did, what you didn't do." "I know," Marcus said, "but you didn't lie to me. You could have. When you recognized my markings, you could have said nothing. Let me keep believing you were just some rancher who got unlucky." She looked at him directly, and her eyes held something Marcus couldn't name. Not forgiveness, but maybe its distant, harder-edged cousin. "You chose not to. You chose the truth, even though it cost you everything." The storm howled on, and in that shelter of stone and impossible honesty, 2 people who should have been enemies began the agonizing work of figuring out what comes after unforgivable, and whether survival itself might be the cruelest punishment or the last remaining grace. When the storm finally exhausted itself on the 3rd morning, they emerged from that stone shelter into a world transformed and devastated, in equal measure. The desert had been resculpted by wind into alien topography, familiar landmarks buried or relocated, and Ayanna's wagon, that vessel of her survival and movement, lay on its side like a dying animal. The wheel Marcus had so carefully repaired snapped clean through by forces beyond any human engineering. But it was what they couldn't see that destroyed Ayanna's carefully maintained composure. The photograph of Dakota, the one she kept tucked in her belt, the single physical proof that her daughter had existed and mattered and been loved. It was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of their desperate migration to shelter, disappeared into sand that had already swallowed so many of her people's stories. Marcus watched Ayanna's face as she searched through scattered supplies with increasing desperation, watched the precise moment when denial gave way to devastating acceptance, and he understood that some losses cut deeper than death, because they erased the evidence that love ever happened at all. He didn't ask permission, didn't announce his intention. Marcus simply dropped to his hands and knees in the sand and began to search, his ruined legs screaming objection that he ignored with the practice of a man who'd learned that physical pain was easy compared to the other kind. He crawled through debris fields and dune formations, fingers combing through sand grain by grain, retracing their path from the night before the storm, when everything had been chaos and desperation. Ayanna called after him once. "Marcus, it's gone. Just leave it." But he didn't stop, couldn't stop, because this wasn't about the photograph anymore, if it ever had been. This was about demonstrating through action what words could never accomplish, that he understood what had been taken, what could never be restored, and that he would break himself trying anyway, not because it would fix anything, but because trying was the only dignity left to him. An hour passed, then two. The sun climbed higher, turning the post-storm desert into a furnace, and Marcus's vision began to blur at the edges from dehydration and pain and sheer stubborn refusal to accept another loss in a long line of losses. His hands were bleeding from rock-sharp debris. His leg had soaked through fresh bandages. And then, wedged between two stones that had been driven together by the storm's violence, he saw the corner of something that wasn't desert, wasn't natural, was the brown-tinted edge of old photograph paper. Marcus extracted it with the delicacy of a man defusing explosives, barely breathing, terrified it would disintegrate at his touch. The photograph was torn along one edge and sand-scoured but intact. Dakota's face, captured at maybe 5 years old, smiling with the unself-conscious joy of a child who didn't yet know the world was cruel, stared up at him from across the decades. He brought it to Ayanna with both hands, offering it like the sacred relic it was. Their fingers touched as she took it, and in that moment of contact, Marcus felt something pass between them that had no name in any language he knew. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps recognition. Recognition that grief and guilt were both forms of love turned inside out, that monsters were sometimes just broken people who'd made irreversible choices, and that the hardest thing in the world wasn't hating someone who'd harmed you, but allowing yourself to see their humanity anyway. Ayanna looked at the photograph, then at Marcus's bleeding hands, then at his face. Really looked, the first time since the confession that she'd met his eyes without walls between them. "You could have stopped after 10 minutes, she said quietly. Could have told yourself you tried." "I couldn't," Marcus replied, and those 2 words contained everything he'd learned about who he was now versus who he'd been then. Ayanna studied him for a long moment. This man who'd punished himself far more thoroughly than she ever could, who didn't want forgiveness because he understood he had no right to want anything. Then she made a decision that would change both their futures. "I'm heading to the settlement 15 miles north," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "There's a community there, some of my people who survived, who've been rebuilding, trying to make something that lasts." She paused, and the pause was weighted with implications Marcus didn't dare examine. "My wagon's broken. I need help carrying supplies." It wasn't forgiveness. It was something infinitely more complicated. The choice to allow his penance to continue, to give him the opportunity to be useful rather than destroyed, to let him prove through sustained action, rather than momentary heroics, that his transformation was real. Marcus understood this with absolute clarity. "I'll help you get there," he said carefully, "and then I'll leave. Go wherever you tell me to go." "Maybe," Ayanna said, and the single word opened up possibilities Marcus had thought were foreclosed forever. Or maybe you stay. The settlement needs workers, building, farming, people who won't quit when the work gets hard or the memories get heavy. She turned to face him fully. My people need hands that will show up every day and do the work, even when nobody's grateful, even when it's never enough. You think you can do that? The question hung in the desert air between them. And Marcus knew it wasn't really about carpentry or agriculture. It was about whether he had the courage to face his victims' survivors every single day, to live with their justified anger and justified distrust, to build something useful from the ruins of what he'd helped destroy. Yes, he said simply, and meant it with every atom of his being. So they walked, side by side across 15 miles of punishing desert terrain. Marcus carrying her salvaged supplies on his damaged body, Ayanna setting a pace that was merciful enough to be survivable, but merciless enough to cost him. The load was brutal. His leg throbbed with every step. Sweat poured down his spine, and salt stung his eyes, and several times he nearly collapsed. But he didn't complain, didn't ask to rest. Because this walk was the rest of his life, in miniature, difficult, painful, necessary, and done in the presence of the person he'd wronged most grievously. As they walked, Ayanna began to talk. Not forgiveness, but memory. She told him about Dakota's first word, her favorite game, the way she'd tried to teach her mother bird songs. She told him about her husband who died 2 years before the march, about her mother who'd made it halfway before her heart gave out, about the community they were walking toward that was built on survival and spite and the refusal to let genocide be the final word. Marcus listened, really listened, because listening was all he could offer, and sometimes bearing witness was the most revolutionary act possible. They reached a ridge overlooking the settlement as the sun began its descent, painting the valley in amber light. Below them, Marcus could see it. Small, resilient, rebuilt from ashes by people who'd every right to surrender but hadn't. Gardens carved from hostile earth. Buildings constructed from reclaimed materials. Children playing near a well. Ayanna stopped at the ridge's edge. She would have been your age now, she said quietly, staring down at those playing children. Dakota, if she'd survived, maybe with children of her own. Marcus's face crumpled, and he didn't try to hide it. I'm sorry, was too small a phrase to carry the weight of what he felt, so he said nothing at all. Just stood there with tears running into his beard, a broken man on a ridge overlooking a second chance he'd never earned. Ayanna looked at him one last time before descending toward the settlement. You can't bring her back, she said, her voice hard but not cruel. Can't fix what happened or make it right. But you can help make sure we survive now, that we have a future worth the price we paid. She started walking down the ridge. So don't stop, don't quit, don't run. Marcus followed, and in that following was a choice, the choice to show up, to endure, to be useful, to let his actions speak the apology his words never could. In the settlement, Ayanna introduced him simply. This is Marcus, he's helping. People eyed him with warranted suspicion, some recognizing the bearing of a former soldier, but Ayanna's word carried weight, earned through shared suffering. She handed him tools. Start there, she said, pointing to a half-built structure that would become someone's home. Marcus worked until his hands bled and the sun set and rose again, and in that work was the only redemption possible. Not the erasure of sin, but the daily choice to be different, witnessed by those he'd harmed, forever. Because sometimes the hardest journey isn't the one that breaks your body, it's the one that forces you to live with what you've done and become someone worthy of having been forgiven. even if forgiveness never comes.